Hey, we're still on the global trade and profits and, rationalizing any kind of profits at the expense of basic morality still. Um, and so in this video, we are going to move into the slave trade. Early on, at the very, very beginning of the slave trade, European slavers would actually go out and capture African slaves themselves. Uh, that proved a little bit more difficult and uh, harder than the Europeans wanted to take part in. And so, very, very quickly, those European slavers transitioned to purchasing slaves from African governments. Um, Most of those, about two-thirds of those, were prisoners of war, and about a third of them were debtors. Now, a thing to remember though, European slavery is markedly different than African slavery. European slavery, as most of us kind of have a somewhat of an understanding of, is a lifelong condition, and the status of slaves are passed down to their children. African slavery is a much different kind of a prospect. Most of the time, under African slavery, especially like for prisoners of war and debtors and things, uh, those people that are enslaved in Africa at this time were basically treated as indentured servants. So those two-thirds that were prisoners of war, they would be captured from other groups and brought into the new group, the new kingdom, and they'll be worked for a period of time, a few years possibly. But after that, usually they're accepted and made a part of the new group. And so this is not a lifelong condition. Also, any children that are had during that period of slavery, those kids are not slaves themselves. Those kids are immediately adopted into the new group. And so slavery in Africa is more akin to what we would understand as indentured servitude here in the U.S. Uh, and so that's how that sort of, we kind of need to think about it in those terms. And so African governments that are selling people into slavery, well, their take on slavery is a lot different than what, Europeans kind of understand it as. Um, so overall, though, somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 13 million people are taken out of Africa. And in addition to the absolute horrible human cost, there's also the loss of development. That loss of tremendous, tremendous populations disrupts the growth of a lot of African nations and a lot of their trade. Um, and so, in addition to those people just being removed and massive percentage being worked literally to death, we also have to take into account that really sets back development in the continent of Africa itself tremendously. Um, um, Look what we had with the Black Death in Europe. We cut the population in half, and we have some social changes, but as far as things moving forward in the development of Europe, it sets it back tremendously. About 10 to 13 million people are taken out of Africa. It is estimated out of that 10 to 13 million, about 15% died in passage. Uh, this is the Atlantic Passage, the Middle Passage is extremely, extremely brutal. A lot of African peoples are packed into holds. They're chained down. They're not fed very well. They're crammed in there as tight as possible. Uh, Most slave galleys, which were not tremendously large, could fit about 400 adults and 100 children down in the hold. Um, Now, something we do tend to get wrong uh, in elementary, junior high, sometimes high school. Uh, as brutal as this was, the slavers themselves were not trying to kill people. They were not throwing people overboard for entertainment or anything like that because, and we need to strip away morality here, they're trying to maximize profits. And if you're throwing your human cargo overboard or killing your human cargo, when you get to the new world, you have less human cargo to sell. And so, as much as possible, but unfortunately, we don't have a lot of food to transport, and we're packing so many people in there because we know that some of them will die in the passage, but they do um, as much as profits, I guess, will allow them, for lack of a better way to put that. They do try to make sure that as many people arrive in somewhat healthy conditions because they want to sell them. They're not being nice. They're wanting to sell as many people because they make more money that way. Um, and so that's kind of the somewhat of the mythology that we get, is that the slavers were just killing people left and right. And it was extremely brutal, and people were killed to send a message to the rest of the human cargo. But the idea that, slavers were just killing people for fun, that doesn't really make sense because, again, we're trying to maximize profits here. And as terrible as it sounds, that's almost the way you have to think about when you're discussing slavery, is because the people themselves were stripping morality out of it. They're only focusing on how to make the most money. And to understand some of this, that's kind of where you have to sort of think from. Uh, Now, as far as in the Americas, both South America primarily, South America and the Caribbean primarily, lesser so to what's going to be the United States. This is an economic solution to a labor shortage. Uh, Early on, uh, there was an attempt to enslave the native populations. They were already there. That's who you can grab for the most part fairly easily. We have, greater weapons than them, and that makes sense. Unfortunately, for everybody, most natives died from disease when they were in extensive contact with Europeans. And so the enslaved population of Native Americans, they are dying in massive, massive numbers. And also, if those ones that weren't dying, they're on their home territory and they know where they are. They know what groups that they can escape to and hopefully seek refuge with. And so they're, if they don't die from disease, they're very, very highly likely to escape. And so, in terms of a stable labor pool, Native Americans just won't work for a lot of the emerging plantation operations that are going to spring up, especially in the Caribbean here in just a second. So around 1640, 1630, slavery is going to take hold in the Bahamas. African slavery is going to take hold in the Bahamas. Like I said, there was an effort to enslave Native Americans. Unfortunately, they died of diseases. And from the planter perspective, they were very likely to escape. And so a transition to African slavery solves that labor problem. Uh, Early on, they will attempt to grow tobacco, but very, very quickly they found sugar to be much, much more profitable. Uh, and, that's going to be bad for the enslaved population because a couple of things. We are down near the equator in the Caribbean, and sugar has a pretty fast growing season. It can gain maturity pretty quickly within, several months. And since we're down on the equator, the planting season can last about 9, 10 months out of the year. So there's only literally 2 months where it's slightly not great conditions for planting. And so the sugar planters, what they will do is they'll set up one field to plant and harvest. For my hand, they'll set up one field to plant and harvest, and you plant here, and then you move on to the next field and harvest that. And by the time this second field is harvested, you move back to the first one, and that one is ready to harvest by that time as well. And so it's almost an ongoing kind of a planting and harvesting cycle. Uh, and during harvest for sugarcane, that was one of the absolute worst times. Slaves on the sugarcane harvest worked generally about 19 to 20 hours a day. The reason being is because once you cut sugarcane, you have to crush it and boil it pretty quickly, or otherwise it turns bitter. And so harvesting has to be done very quickly once you start that process. And sadly, slaves on sugar plantations are largely worked literally to death. Um, and so for Brazil and most of the Caribbean islands, where honestly 90% of the African slaves go, uh, they're growing sugar and they're going to literally work their slaves to death. And as counterintuitive as that sounds, and as expensive, literally as expensive as slaves were to procure, that works for them in terms of profit versus loss. A slave, sugar is so expensive and such a valuable commodity. A slave would pay for themselves working for a couple of years. So literally you could purchase a slave and they would make back the money that you spent on them within a couple of years. And so to work them to death, you would still realize a profit. And so most slaves on sugar plantations, literally, they last about 5 years before they are worked to death. And even, working someone to death and having them die within 5 years, the sugar plantations are going to be insanely profitable. And that's going to be, unfortunately, the situation for that. Another terrible thing that the sugar plantations are going to spread to the rest of the Americas are the slave codes. Basically, these are laws that regulate the treatment of slaves, and they're written so loosely that they might as well have said that you can do whatever you want. The first slave codes are passed in Barbados in 1661. And those basically say there are no limits on how or why a master could punish a slave. And so there were vicious beatings and whippings with, some slaves being beaten to death as sort of a warning to other slaves. And those slave codes, there's quite a few of them. If you want to dig into them, they're pretty easy to find. Those are going to transfer from Barbados, from the Caribbean, up into North America and into other places that are going to embrace African slavery as a labor solution, unfortunately. So, last thing on that, again, just like we saw with the East India Company that, monopolizes trade to India, there's going to be a company that monopolizes trade in Africa, and that's the Royal African Company. It's going to be a joint stock company created in England, and it will, uh, amass, monies to transport African slaves to the New World, and that's how that company in itself, makes its living. Uh, and they will have a monopoly from their creation about 16, I think it's 1620, but I could be wrong. But they will have a monopoly until about 1690. And after 1690, they lose their monopoly, and that opens up the floodgates really for other competitors to go into Africa and purchase slaves themselves and transport those to the New World. And so that actually, unfortunately, brings down the price of slaves. And so slaves are still pouring into the Caribbean and to Brazil, especially. But now slavery is going to take hold in North America as well after that. So thanks. We'll see you next time.